research for this video would have been next to impossible without the assistance of our Latin American team members and their expertise at translating material from their native languages. Knowing other common languages, tensions between the new sovereignties would only escalate when the huge Spanish colonial territory known as the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata revolted in the 1810s, resulting in the independence of Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. All three of these countries promptly began engaging in significant border disputes over the mostly uncharted regions that lay between their population centers. Seeing an opportunity to project its sphere of influence further south, the Empire of Brazil recognized the independence of Paraguay in 1844, placing them in direct opposition to Argentina, which considered Paraguay a breakaway province. But this is Latin America, and things are never simple in Latin America. Upon gaining their freedom, the new government of Paraguay had wasted no time picking things up right where the Spanish left off, by restarting the decades-old argument over whether the Apa or Branco River should be the demarcation line between their territory and that of Brazil. This meant that while Brazil was trying to use Paraguay as a buffer against the Argentines, the Paraguayan government was belligerently demanding territorial concessions and making it as hard as possible for Brazilian ships to use the Paraguay River. Adding to this tangled mess of conflicting interests was the situation in Uruguay, which was torn between two main political parties, the Colorados and the Blancos. Brazil had already intervened twice in Uruguayan affairs by 1855, and in 1863 they stepped in again after the Colorados rebelled against the reigning Blanco party, which was allied to Paraguay at the time. Thoroughly annoyed with the fractious two-party state, Brazil issued an ultimatum to the Blanco government, demanding that they protect Brazilian interests in the region or face an invasion. The Blanco government refused, and Brazilian warships promptly obliterated Uruguay's minuscule navy and marched across the border in October of 1864. The Brazilians assumed that a swift resolution to the Blanco situation would prevent interference from Uruguay's allies, only for this notion to be swiftly disproven when Paraguayan Marines stormed aboard the Brazilian steamer Marquês de Olinda as it approached their capital city of Asunción on November 13th. This was followed swiftly by a formal declaration of war between the two nations on December 13th. The belligerent attitude demonstrated by the tiny nation of Paraguay towards the gigantic empire of Brazil stemmed primarily from the grandiose ambitions of a single man, President Francisco Solano Lopez, aka the wannabe Napoleon of South America. The son of Paraguay's first president, Lopez came to power in September of 1862 and immediately set about preparing his country for war. Though it possessed barely 500,000 citizens compared to Brazil's 11 million, Paraguay had invested heavily into its military and cobbled together a force of about 70,000 men at a time when Brazil was fielding fewer than half that number. But ragtag barely even began to describe the state of Lopez's men, as many of them lacked even basic necessities like shoes. However, this did not stop the aspirational Latin American Grande Armée from scoring several early victories against the Empire in the opening phases of the war, wounding the giant as it struggled to mobilize more than a token force along its southern border. However, the rash actions of Paraguay's eccentric dictator would have dire consequences, as after decades of jockeying for position, the two largest Latin American nations now had a common cause, and diplomats from Argentina soon met with those from the Empire of Brazil to hammer out a formal alliance against Paraguay. While negotiations were ongoing, Brazilian armies were busy mopping up resistance in Uruguay, with Lopez now far too busy looting, pillaging, and murdering his way through Corrientes to care about little things like aiding his allies. The Blancos stood no chance against the Brazilian army of the south. On the 2nd of February, Montevideo, the capital of Uruguay, was under siege, surrendering on the 20th. By May, the Colorados had taken over and concluded a formal military pact with Brazil and Argentina, creating a triple alliance that could now focus its attention on Paraguay. Just like his hero Napoleon Bonaparte, Francisco Lopez had successfully managed to unite his opposition into a coalition with the express purpose of crushing his imperial ambitions forever. In yet another comparison to the Napoleonic Wars, Brazilian naval dominance allowed them to isolate Paraguay's economy by blockading the Rio de la Plata. This sparked the Battle of the Riachuelo, the largest naval engagement in South American history. When Lopez ordered the Paraguayan Navy to launch from the fortress of Humaitá and ambush the blockade on the 11th of June, 1865. Lopez had given strict orders to his admiral, Pedro Ignacio Mesa, to conduct a surprise attack and boarding operation to capture the enemy fleet while it lay mostly at anchor. But Mesa ignored these orders and instead opened fire as soon as he was within range. This initial barrage inflicted some damage on the Brazilian fleet, but it also alerted the shore-bound crews, who scrambled back aboard their ships and launched a counterattack. Thick fog made gunfire on both sides highly inaccurate, but for a time it seemed as if the Paraguayans had the upper hand. However, the tide of battle turned abruptly when Brazilian Admiral Francisco Manuel Barroso charged Mesa's line, smashing several of the smaller enemy warships and barges beneath the prow of his paddle steamer. At around the same time, Admiral Mesa was hit in the chest, forcing his fleet to make a disorderly withdrawal under heavy fire. Barroso's quick thinking would earn him the title Baron of the Amazonas, while Mesa's insubordination would have earned him a firing squad had not the injuries he sustained in battle proved fatal only 8 days later. The defeat at the Battle of Riachuelo marked a permanent turning point in the fortunes of the upstart Paraguayans and their eccentric dictator. With Uruguay now part of the Triple Alliance, Lopez now ordered his army to invade the country through Corrientes in the hopes of quickly toppling the Colorados regime. But his advancing columns were turned back as they tried to cross the Uruguayan River. At the Battle of Jutai, a force of only 3,000 Paraguayans faced off against a combined army of at least 9,000 enemy troops. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the Paraguayan cavalry inflicted heavy losses on the enemy infantry, but the entire force was eventually killed or captured. With increasing numbers of Allied troops advancing into the Corrientes, Lopez withdrew back into Paraguay to prepare for an invasion. Without the element of surprise, the Paraguayans charged the defenders head-on, causing massive casualties on both sides. The poor terrain delayed the main advance, resulting in attacks coming in waves rather than the planned single huge assault. Throughout the day, Paraguayan cavalry caused havoc all along the Allied line, only being driven back by artillery fire and infantry squares. By the time the fighting ceased, the Allied force had taken 3,000 casualties in exchange for nearly 13,000 Paraguayan losses. This was an enormous blow to Lopez's ambitions, forcing him to refill his depleted ranks with the elderly and underaged. But on the other hand, the Allied army had come very close to breaking during the frantic engagement and needed time to rest and reorganize. While they waited, disease broke out in the camp, striking down men by the thousands. With reinforcements trickling in at a snail's pace, the advance into Paraguay stalled, devolving into primitive trench warfare. Both sides at a temporary impasse, Lopez reached out to the Argentine president, Bartolomé Mitre, and attempted to negotiate a peace treaty. But Mitre insisted Lopez surrender unconditionally, which only encouraged Lopez to resist to the bitter end. Following the negotiations, the invaders attempted to break through the fortified lines around Curupayty in September. Assuming naval bombardment would paralyze the defenders, the overconfident attackers became trapped in muddy terrain and slaughtered by hidden artillery positions. Nearly 4,000 Allied troops died in the foolhardy attack, making Curupayty their worst defeat of the war. Sadly for the defiant Lopez, success at Curupayty only amounted to a temporary stay of execution. By now, the Triple Alliance had agreed on appointing the Duke of Caxias to command the invasion, and this veteran officer quickly began reforming the dispirited army into a force capable of assaulting Paraguay's ultimate defensive bastion, the gigantic fortress of Humayta. Sitting astride the river from which the country drew its name, Humayta blocked all access to Asuncion, and even prevented the Brazilians from retaking the Paraguayan-occupied territory of Mato Grosso. Well aware of the enormous task that lay ahead, the Iron Duke chose to spend nearly 8 whole months training his men, improving camp sanitation, and refitting his artillery corps. When he was ready, Caxias swept north from Tuyuti and began the painstaking process of surrounding Humayta. A series of assaults were launched on the fortress throughout August, but were met with failure, while a massive chain across the river prevented the Brazilian Navy from isolating Humayta completely. It took Caxias until November to isolate the bastion by land. But it was not until February of 1868 that a daring rush through heavy fire allowed the Navy to take control of the whole river. Caxias then ordered his ironclads to proceed upstream and bombard the capital of Asuncion, while his army continued besieging its objective. Realizing their position had been rendered strategically worthless, Humayta's defenders staged a series of breakouts in July, surrendering the position at a final cost of around 1,500 casualties. Sitting astride the river from which the country drew its name, Humayta blocked all access to the Asuncion. Having broken down the gates of Paraguay, Caxias continued to live up to his reputation by ignoring the impressive secondary defensive line Lopez had constructed along the Piquicidi tributary and instead cutting a 10.7-kilometer or 6.6-mile-long road through the supposedly impenetrable jungle. Against all odds, the Allied army was able to conceal this operation until December, then burst out behind enemy lines and decimated the Paraguayans in a series of hard-fought engagements known collectively as the Desembrada. This culminated in the Battle of Lomas Valentinas, where Caxias and Lopez went head-to-head in a lopsided engagement that nearly resulted in the Paraguayan dictator being captured alongside his senior staff officers. Only a desperate rush through the enemy lines at the height of the battle by his cavalry corps saved Lopez from an ignominious fate, and he vanished into the jungle alongside the tattered remnants of Paraguay's army. With no enemies left to oppose him on the battlefield, the victorious Iron Duke of Brazil moved to occupy Asuncion, which was mostly abandoned. Having spent years on campaign, Caxias was exhausted, and would soon return home as one of Latin America's greatest military heroes. Meanwhile, a force of 30,000 Allied soldiers began looting and burning the Paraguayan capital, reducing it to ruins. The fortress of Humayta was also razed to the ground, and over the next few months, the Triple Alliance would work systematically to obliterate Paraguay's infrastructure. Lopez responded with an increasingly brutal campaign of guerrilla warfare that saw Paraguayan troops burning their own settlements in a scorched earth campaign and shooting potential deserters on the spot. This insurgency would continue until the Battle of Sejucura on the 1st of March, 1870, when 4,000 Brazilian soldiers located and hunted down Lopez's personal guard of 400. Defiant to the last, Lopez refused to surrender and was stabbed by a Brazilian cavalryman. Despite the mortal injury, the former dictator kept fighting until he collapsed next to a riverbank. When again offered clemency, Lopez replied by shouting, "Muero con mi patria," or "I die with my nation," and was shot dead.